here we are. This is Sex Love Psychedelics, and I'm your host, Dr. Kat, bringing you psychosexual conversations that will leave you intellectually turned on and hungry for more.
I think the last research I read, and maybe you have something updated, is from 2020, that there was about 13% of Americans who are on antidepressants. And I'm sure that grew even more because of the pandemic. But if we start talking about depression and the theories around it, to really anchor our listeners into the alternative narratives or what's out there before we dive into the psychedelics and before we dive into alternative treatments. But how do you approach that, or how do you see from your information, from what you have versus the narrative, the cultural narrative around depression?
Yeah. So I think the cultural narrative around depression is very much that it's an individual sort of thing, and that there's something that is happening in your life that is perhaps separate from other people's lives that's leading you to feel this way. Whereas I think a lot of the times mental illness really should be thought of as sort of like a cultural sort of thing. Like why is it that if it's my individual problem that I'm depressed, that depression is epidemic and more people are experiencing it than ever before? It seems like, well, that would imply that there's some type of conditions out there in society that is making people feel depressed or unhappy, rather than it's something to do with my own, personal kind of biology. And then it makes you wonder, it's like, well, is it truly depression a lot of the time, or is it just like that's actually a natural response to the conditions that are happening in the world? So I don't know, just going back to the psychiatric Bible, the DSM, right? Like thinking about like what their definition of depression is, it's really a cluster of symptoms, right? You're supposed to have 5 out of 9 symptoms in the cluster, and they should be persistent every day or most days for at least 2 weeks. And that's how you're going to define like a major depressive episode. So as far as like, okay, as far as recognizing someone that's feeling depressed, I think that definition is fine for the illness. But if you sort of think about, does that give you any insight into the etiology, into the root cause of why they're feeling that way? The answer is no, not really, or not at all. And there's so many different reasons that a person could feel that way, particularly depression, anxiety, I'll say like PTSD, like things like this. These are more like what we consider like biopsychosocial illnesses, where it's like, okay, there is a potential biological component of depression. There are certain genes or family histories, like hereditary types of connections that you can find. I think the difficulty there is like, it's always like a nature versus nurture. Is like, is it really in the genes, or is it just the fact that this family all grew up together with the same habits, like interacting in the same kind of way? But I think that there's just a lot of other circumstantial types of things, people trapped in jobs that they don't like, or relationships that are not satisfying to them. And yeah, exactly. It's just like, okay, so the definition, like the symptom cluster, seems like fairly reasonable, but that symptom cluster and the diagnosis of depression probably represents a really heterogeneous type of etiology pool overall, which, I don't know, like on the one hand, there's these symptoms and it seems like those are reasonable, but if those symptoms don't really lead you any insight into the etiology, then I don't know, you're left with just sort of blanket generalized treatments rather than anything that's specific for a person.
Well, that was fun. Thanks for tuning in, lovers. And if you want to experience more ecstasy and sexual liberation, head over to sexlovepsychedelics.com and learn about how you can join me for any one of my online or live events. And while you're there, grab my free guide on sex and psychedelics. Remember, this podcast is for entertainment and educational purposes only. Please contact your healthcare provider and local law before pursuing any of the products or psychedelics discussed. And one final note here. I make this show specifically for you. If you're loving the show, then be sure to leave me a review in iTunes or Spotify to let me know. Happy to be here and happy to serve. I'll see you next time on Sex Love Psychedelics.